Today's story is about a young Hollywood actor who was one of the most promising up-and-coming stars in America, and who on a Wednesday morning in September of 2012 walked out of a beautiful old boarding house in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles and started attacking his neighbors with a piece of wood in the middle of the street. And when the police finally got to that boarding house and they went inside, what they found in there was so disturbing that even the LAPD veterans who worked the scene said they had never seen anything like it. And to this day, the reason it happened is still a mystery. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. At around 10 in the morning on Wednesday, September 26, 2012, in a very quiet, wealthy neighborhood on the outskirts of Los Angeles, a woman was standing in her kitchen making coffee when she heard something that made her stop. Because through her open window, coming from the property next door, she could hear a woman screaming. Now, the neighborhood this woman lived in was called Los Feliz. It sits right next to Griffith Park, and it is one of the most expensive neighborhoods in all of Los Angeles. The kind of place where a lot of the houses cost multiple millions of dollars, and where you can see the Hollywood sign from the top of the hills, and where the streets are lined with palm trees and old Spanish-style mansions. It is a really peaceful neighborhood. So, hearing a woman screaming at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday, right in the middle of it, was completely out of the ordinary. Then, over the next couple of minutes, the screaming got louder, and then she started hearing men yelling too. And when she looked out her kitchen window, she could see, over on the property next door, 3 men out in the driveway. 2 of them were older, and they looked terrified, and they were backing away from a younger man, who was maybe in his late 20s, and who had a 2x4 piece of wood in his hands. And this young guy was swinging the 2x4 at the older men, and screaming at them, and chasing them around the driveway. The woman ran back to her phone and called 911. Within a few minutes, LAPD officers were pulling up to the property. And as they got out of their patrol cars and started walking up the driveway, they could tell right away that something really bad had happened here. Because the driveway itself was quiet now, but the front door of the main house was wide open. Glass was shattered on the porch, and when they walked around to the side of the property, they saw the body of a young man on the concrete of the driveway. He was lying on his back. He was not moving. He was very clearly dead. And when the officers got up close to him, they could see he had massive injuries that were consistent with a fall from a significant height, almost like he had come off the roof. Then the officers slowly walked up the front steps of the house, and they went inside. And what they found inside was even worse, because in one of the rooms of the house was the body of an elderly woman. She had been beaten to death and manually strangled. Her house had been completely ransacked, windows had been broken, furniture had been overturned, and in another room of the house, the officers found the body of the woman's cat, which had also been killed. And when they started walking through the rest of the house, kind of trying to piece together what had happened, they realized this was not a normal house, because there were bedrooms everywhere, and each bedroom had somebody living in it. This was a boarding house, and the elderly woman lying dead in the front room was the woman who owned it. Her name was Catherine Chabot Davis. She was 81 years old, and she was one of the most beloved figures in the Hollywood struggling actor community. Because Catherine Davis's house, which was located in the 3600 block of a street called Lowry Road, was not just a boarding house. It was actually a famous property in Hollywood called the Writers' Villa. And for decades, Catherine Davis had run the Writers' Villa as a kind of unofficial safe haven for young actors and writers who had just moved to Los Angeles to chase the dream, but who could not really afford rent. Catherine would rent rooms out to these young artists at really affordable prices, and she would basically become like a second mother to them. She would feed them. She would give them advice. She would help them get on their feet. Everyone who had ever lived at the Writers' Villa considered Catherine Davis, in the words of one of her former tenants, quote, a near saint. She was 81 years old, she was a widow, she was kind, she had spent her entire life helping people, and now she was dead in her own home, and her killer was the young man lying in the driveway. When the LAPD ran the young man's ID and it came back with his name, they were completely shocked. Because the young man who had just murdered Catherine Davis and killed her cat and attacked her neighbors with a 2x4 and then fallen off the roof of the writer's villa was not just some random struggling actor. His name was Jonathan Kendrick Lewis, and most of America knew him as Johnny Lewis. Johnny Lewis had been born in Los Angeles in October of 1983, and from the time he was really young, he had been trying to make it as an actor. In his early 20s, he had started getting small guest roles on all kinds of hit TV shows. He had been on Boston Public. He had been on Judging Amy. He had been on Malcolm in the Middle. He had even been on Drake and Josh. Then in 2005, when Johnny was 21 years old, he was cast in a 2-season recurring role on the Fox teen drama The O.C., where he played a character named Dennis Cheeley Childress. And around this same time, he actually started dating a young pop singer who was on the verge of her own major breakthrough. Her name was Katy Perry, and Johnny and Katy dated for about a year and a half. Then in 2007, Johnny landed a role in a horror movie called AVPR, Aliens vs. Predator Requiem. And then in 2008, Johnny got the biggest role of his entire career. He was cast in a brand new FX drama called Sons of Anarchy, where he would play a character named Kip Halfsack Epps, who was basically the youngest and most innocent member of the outlaw motorcycle club that the show revolved around. And Sons of Anarchy became a massive hit. Johnny was one of the standout characters, and by the end of season 1, everyone who was watching the show basically loved Halfsack. And in 2010, Johnny appeared in the movie The Runaways alongside Kristen Stewart and Dakota Fanning. And so by 2010, Johnny Lewis was on a really steep upward trajectory. But then, sometime around 2011, something started going wrong with Johnny. His character on Sons of Anarchy had been killed off at the end of season 2, and it seemed like after that, Johnny kind of started to unravel. He stopped getting cast in new roles. He started missing meetings with his agents. He started having really erratic behavior. And most alarmingly, he started getting arrested. Between the end of 2011 and the summer of 2012, Johnny Lewis was arrested multiple times. There were arrests for drug possession. There were arrests for assault. There were arrests for burglary. There were reports that Johnny had been picked up wandering the streets of Los Angeles, talking to himself. And in every case, when Johnny would show up in court, his lawyers would argue that he was suffering from a serious mental illness and that he needed treatment and not jail time. And the court would send Johnny to some kind of psychological counseling or a mental health program. But then Johnny would either check himself out of the program early, or he would just stop showing up. And then he would get arrested again for something else. In May of 2012, so about 4 months before Johnny would die at the writer's villa, a probation officer who had been assigned to Johnny sat down and wrote a formal report about him. And in that report, the probation officer said, quote, "I am very concerned for the well-being of not only the community, but that of the defendant," which is basically as strong of a warning as a probation officer can put in a court document. The officer was saying, in writing, that they believed Johnny Lewis was a danger to other people and to himself, and that something bad was going to happen if he did not get real help. But the criminal justice system in Los Angeles is huge, and the mental health system is stretched thin, and this warning basically got lost in the shuffle. Johnny was arrested again in the summer of 2012, and he spent the next several months in the Los Angeles County Jail. Then on September 21st, 2012, Johnny Lewis was released. 5 days later, on the morning of September 26th, he was standing in the driveway of the writer's villa, swinging a 2x4 at the neighbors. Now, when the story of what had happened at the writer's villa broke in the news that afternoon, the whole country was in shock, because Johnny Lewis was a name a lot of people recognized. And the almost immediate assumption from law enforcement and from the media and from basically everyone who was following the story was that Johnny must have been on some kind of horrible drug that had made him snap. Because his behavior had been so violent and so bizarre and so out of character even for a guy who had been struggling that people just assumed he must have been on something. LAPD investigators actually publicly speculated that Johnny might have been on a new designer drug called Smiles, which had been in the news around that time for causing violent psychotic episodes in teenagers. And an LAPD commander even told a local news station that officers at the scene had observed Johnny displaying what he described as, quote, superhuman strength, which is a phrase that gets associated with certain kinds of drug intoxication. And for the first couple of months after the incident, that was basically the official narrative. Johnny Lewis had been on drugs. It was a drug-fueled rampage. Case closed. Except when the autopsy report finally came back from the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office in late November of 2012, that whole narrative fell apart. Because when the coroner tested Johnny Lewis's blood for drugs, they did not find drugs. They did not find any drugs. There was no cocaine in his system. There was no marijuana. There was no alcohol. There was no methamphetamine. There was no ecstasy. There was no smiles. There were no antipsychotic medications. There were no psychedelic substances of any kind. Johnny Lewis's toxicology report was completely, totally clean. And when the autopsy looked at Johnny's physical condition, they found something else that was really disturbing. Because on Johnny's neck were nail marks. And Johnny had a partial strangulation injury, which meant that at some point during what happened inside of the writer's villa, Catherine Davis, this 81-year-old woman, had actually tried to fight back against the young man who was killing her. She had reached up, and she had grabbed at his throat, and she had tried to fight him off. And Johnny had killed her anyway. The coroner also ruled Johnny's death an accident. Their conclusion was that after Johnny had killed Catherine Davis inside of the house, he had either climbed onto the roof or gotten out onto a balcony, possibly trying to escape, and he had lost his balance and fallen the 3 stories down into the driveway. But when the autopsy report was released, the drug theory was dead, which left basically everybody, the police, the media, the public, with one really disturbing question. If Johnny Lewis had not been on drugs, then what had made him do what he did? What made a 28-year-old actor who had once been on one of the most popular shows on television and who had dated a future pop superstar walk into the room of an 81-year-old widow who had opened her home to him and beat her to death and kill her cat and then attack the neighbors and then fall off a roof? And the answer that the people closest to Johnny Lewis, including his own mother, and the creator of Sons of Anarchy, a guy named Kurt Sutter, ultimately gave was that Johnny had been suffering from a really serious, untreated mental illness that had been getting worse for years. Johnny had apparently been dealing with religious and spiritual delusions. He had been hearing voices. He had come to believe that he had been chosen for some kind of divine mission. And the criminal justice system had been trying over and over to force him into treatment, but had never really been able to keep him there. And the exact thing that his probation officer had warned about in that report from May of 2012 had ended up happening. Johnny had become a danger to the community and to himself, and nobody had been able to stop it in time. Kurt Sutter, the guy who had created Sons of Anarchy and had actually cast Johnny in the role that had made him famous, put out a public statement after the news of Johnny's death broke. And in that statement, Sutter said, quote, "It was a tragic end for an extremely talented guy who unfortunately had lost his way. I am deeply sorry that an innocent life had to be thrown in his destructive path." And that innocent life was Catherine Davis. The writer's villa, the boarding house on Lowry Road, where Catherine had spent decades quietly helping struggling young actors get their start in Hollywood, was eventually sold. And for anybody who drives through the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles today, and who looks up at the beautiful old Spanish-style houses along Lowry Road, there is no plaque, and there is no marker, and there is nothing that tells you which house it was. But somewhere on that block, on the morning of September 26th, 2012, a young rising Hollywood actor named Johnny Lewis, who was not on drugs and who was not being provoked, and who had no rational reason for what he did, walked into the room of a woman who had welcomed him into her home. And whatever it was that was going on inside of his head that morning is a mystery that, to this day, no one has ever been able to fully explain. The man behind the door today's story is about one of the most famous sitcom actors in the history of American television, who spent the last decade of his life leading a secret double life that basically nobody around him knew about. And when the truth about that double life finally came out, it came out because of what somebody did to him inside of an apartment in Arizona. The prime suspect was arrested. He went to trial. But what happened next in that courtroom shocked the entire country. And to this day, 45 years later, no one has ever been convicted of the crime. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 29th, 1978, a 32-year-old actress named Victoria Ann Berry was driving through the streets of Scottsdale, Arizona, and she pulled into the parking lot of an apartment complex called the Winfield Place Apartments. She was going there to check on a friend of hers, an older guy in his late 40s, who she had been co-starring with in a play at a local dinner theater, because that morning this guy was supposed to meet Victoria for lunch, and he had never shown up. Victoria had been trying to reach him all morning, but he was not answering his phone, so she just drove over to his apartment to see if he was okay. When she got to the parking lot, she walked up to Unit 132A on the first floor, and she knocked on the door. There was no answer. She tried the handle, and to her surprise, the door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The moment she stepped inside that apartment, she noticed something was very, very wrong. The air inside of the apartment felt heavy, and it smelled like copper. When she looked around, she could see that the walls were covered in what looked like dried blood. There was blood spatter on the ceiling. There was blood on the carpet. There was blood on the door frame. And the apartment was completely silent. Not even the sound of a fan or a radio. Victoria kind of froze up. Then she slowly walked further into the apartment, and she peered around the corner into the bedroom. And there, on the bed, was her friend and co-star, lying on his side, curled up almost like he had just been sleeping. Someone had beaten him to death. And around his neck, tied in a neat, careful bow, was a black electrical cord. He had been dead for hours. Victoria basically ran out of the apartment screaming, and she called the police. Within minutes, the parking lot of the Winfield Place Apartments was swarmed by Scottsdale police officers. When the police walked into Unit 132A and they saw what was inside, they were completely shocked. Because this was not just some random guy who had been murdered in his sleep. The man in that bedroom was one of the most famous television actors in America. But to really understand how this guy had ended up dead in an apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, in the summer of 1978, you kind of have to go all the way back to 1928. In July of 1928, in Waterbury, Connecticut, a woman named Rose gave birth to a baby boy, and she and her husband, a guy named Alfred, named the baby Robert Edward. But from the time he was little, everybody just called him Bob. Bob grew up mostly in a town called Stamford, and from the time he was really little, he was completely obsessed with music. When Bob was 11 years old, he picked up a pair of drumsticks for the first time. And pretty much right away, he was a natural. By the time he was in high school, Bob was actually good enough on the drums that he was performing with real professional bands around Connecticut. He thought for a while that he was going to be a professional drummer. But at some point in his early 20s, he kind of pivoted and he started working in radio. It turned out Bob was also a natural at radio. He had this really smooth, deep, funny voice. He had this quick, sharp wit, and he was really likable on the mic. Bob started out working at small radio stations in New York and Connecticut, but then in 1956, he got a huge job offer. He got hired at a big radio station in Los Angeles called KNX, which was a CBS station. Bob moved out to LA and took over the morning drive time show. Within a couple of years, Bob's morning show was the #1 rated morning radio show in all of Los Angeles. Because he was so popular, huge celebrities started showing up on his show as guests. People like Marilyn Monroe and Bob Hope, and even a future president of the United States named Ronald Reagan. The executives over at CBS were watching all of this, and they saw that Bob was this really funny, charming, good-looking guy who could hold his own with any celebrity in Hollywood. They thought, we need to put this guy on television. So they started giving Bob small guest roles on their comedy shows, kind of testing him out. Then in 1965, CBS offered Bob the lead role in a brand new sitcom that they were about to launch. It was a really strange idea for a sitcom. It was a comedy set inside of a German prisoner of war camp during World War II, and Bob would play the lead character, an American colonel named Robert Hogan, who was the leader of the American prisoners. The show was called Hogan's Heroes. Bob signed on, and the show premiered in the fall of 1965. Hogan's Heroes became a massive hit. It ran for 6 seasons, from 1965 all the way to 1971. Bob was nominated for 2 Emmys for his role as Colonel Hogan. He became one of the most recognizable faces on American television, and his name, Bob Crane, was in every entertainment magazine in the country. He had a wife, he had kids, he had a big house in California, he was making really good money, and from the outside, it basically looked like Bob Crane had it all. But behind the scenes, Bob had a secret. Because from pretty early on in his career, Bob had developed this strange, obsessive hobby. He was completely obsessed with photographing and recording women that he was sleeping with. He had thousands of photographs. He had huge scrapbooks. When consumer video equipment started coming out in the 1960s and 70s, Bob got into that too. He would set up cameras in his hotel rooms and in his houses and film his encounters with women. And then he would keep the tapes, label them, and store them in his collection. Sometime in the late 1960s, in the middle of Hogan's Heroes, one of Bob's co-stars on the show, a British actor named Richard Dawson, who a lot of people might know from later hosting the game show Family Feud, introduced Bob to a friend of his. This friend was a guy named John Henry Carpenter. John Carpenter was a Sony electronics sales manager who worked out of Los Angeles. And because he worked for Sony, he had access to the newest, most advanced consumer video equipment on Earth. Stuff that regular people basically could not get their hands on. When Bob and John met, and John found out about Bob's obsession with recording his encounters, the two of them clicked immediately. They became best friends. For the next roughly 10 years, Bob and John basically had this secret arrangement. John would provide Bob with the top-of-the-line video equipment. Bob, because he was a famous television actor, would attract women in bars and nightclubs. And the two of them together would go on this kind of hunt basically every single night. John Carpenter was actually so committed to this arrangement that he would schedule his Sony sales trips around Bob's schedule, so that no matter where Bob was in the country, John would find a way to be in the same city. And a lot of the people around Bob, including his second wife Patty and his agent, kind of noticed how strange this friendship was, because John Carpenter was not a rich guy. He was not a Hollywood insider. He did not have the same lifestyle as Bob. But he would drop everything and get on a plane and fly across the country just to hang out with Bob for a couple of days at a time. Some of the people around Bob eventually started referring to John, sometimes right to Bob's face, as basically Bob's leech. But Bob did not care, because whatever Bob was getting out of this friendship, he was getting it in a way that he could not get from anybody else in his life. Then in 1971, Hogan's Heroes was canceled. After the show ended, Bob's career basically fell off a cliff. He tried to launch a new sitcom that failed. He tried to do movies that also did not really work. By the mid-1970s, Bob was reduced to doing dinner theater, which is basically these small live theater productions performed in restaurants and hotel ballrooms in smaller cities all across the country. Bob would tour with these plays for weeks at a time, going from city to city, staying in furnished corporate apartments. But even as Bob's career was falling apart, his friendship with John Carpenter and their nightly routine just kept going. Then in June of 1978, Bob went on tour with a play called Beginner's Luck, and one of the stops on the tour was at a place called the Windmill Dinner Theater in Scottsdale, Arizona. Bob checked into a furnished apartment at the Winfield Place Apartments, Unit 132A. Once he got there, he called up John Carpenter, and John flew out from Los Angeles to Scottsdale to spend time with him, just like he always did. But something was different this time, because when Bob had turned 49 years old the previous year, he had kind of had this realization that he was almost 50, and he was doing dinner theater in Arizona, and his career was in shambles, and he wanted to change his life. Bob had actually confided in his son Robert that he was planning to divorce his wife Patty, and he wanted to basically clean house of the people around him. One of the people he wanted to cut out of his life was John Carpenter, because he felt like John had become a bad influence on him. On the night of June 28th, 1978, Bob and John went out to a nightclub in Scottsdale together, and at some point in that nightclub, they got into a huge fight. There were witnesses at the club who later told police that Bob and John had a really heated argument that night, and John left the club. Bob, according to phone records, actually called John later that night from Unit 132A and basically told him their friendship was over. Then Bob went to bed. Sometime in the early morning hours of June 29th, 1978, somebody let themselves into Unit 132A because there was no sign of forced entry. And they walked into Bob Crane's bedroom while he was sleeping, and they picked up a heavy object, which the police later believed was a camera tripod. and they hit Bob Crane in the head with it twice and killed him. This person tied an electrical video cord in a bow around Bob's neck, almost like a signature, and then they walked out of the apartment and they disappeared. Later that afternoon, Bob's co-star Victoria Ann Barry drove over to check on him, and that is when she found what was inside of Unit 132A. Now, the Scottsdale police, from basically the first day of the investigation, believed that they knew who had killed Bob Crane. It was John Henry Carpenter, because he had the motive, which was that Bob had just cut him out of his life. He had the opportunity because he was in Scottsdale and had been with Bob the night before. The police even found a small smear of blood inside of the rental car that John Carpenter had been driving in Scottsdale, and they believed that blood had come from Bob Crane. But there was a huge problem, because when they tried to test that blood, this was 1978, and DNA testing basically did not exist yet. The sample was too small and too degraded to definitively prove anything. So the case just sat unsolved for years. Then in 1990, so 12 years after the murder, a Scottsdale investigator named Barry Vassell and a Maricopa County investigator named Jim Raines decided to reopen the case. They went back through all of the old crime scene photos, and they found a photo that had been taken of the inside of John Carpenter's rental car back in 1978. In that photo, in the trunk of the rental car, they could see what appeared to be a small piece of biological tissue that they believed might be brain tissue from Bob Crane. Based on this photo and the other circumstantial evidence, a judge ruled that there was enough to reopen the case. And so in 1992, John Henry Carpenter was arrested and charged with the murder of Bob Crane. In 1994, John Carpenter went to trial. And the trial itself became a nationwide media event because at this point it had been 16 years since Bob Crane's death, and the American public still remembered him as Colonel Hogan. The courtroom was packed with reporters every single day. During the trial, Bob Crane's own son, Robert Crane, took the stand and testified against John. Robert basically told the jury that his father had ended the friendship with John the night before the murder, that in his opinion, John had absolutely done it, and that his father had actually been afraid of John toward the end of his life. But the trial had a huge problem, because most of the physical evidence was really old, some of it had deteriorated. The alleged brain tissue photo was disputed by the defense's own experts, who said the photo was way too grainy to say what the substance actually was. There was no actual murder weapon that had ever been recovered, and the actual blood evidence was inconclusive. On top of that, the defense argued that if the Scottsdale police had really thought John did it back in 1978, they would have arrested him at the time. And so after a long trial, in October of 1994, the jury acquitted John Henry Carpenter of all charges. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, and the verdict was so shocking to the public that it made the front page of newspapers all across the country. But even after the acquittal, the Scottsdale police still officially considered John Henry Carpenter the prime suspect. They never opened another investigation into anyone else. Then 4 years after the trial, in September of 1998, John Henry Carpenter died of a heart attack in Torrance, California. To this day, no one has ever been convicted of the murder of Bob Crane, and the case is officially unsolved. But Bob's son, Robert, has spoken about it a lot in interviews over the years. He has said that he has no doubt in his mind who killed his father in that apartment in Scottsdale, Arizona, in the early morning hours of June 29, 1978. In 2002, Robert Crane actually helped produce a Hollywood movie about his father's life and death called Autofocus, which was directed by Paul Schrader and starred Greg Kinnear as Bob Crane and Willem Dafoe as John Henry Carpenter. And the movie basically laid out the whole story, from Hogan's Heroes to the double life to that final night at Unit 132A. And to Robert, the fact that John Henry Carpenter walked out of that courtroom in 1994 as a free man and got to live out the rest of his life without ever being held responsible for what happened inside of Unit 132A is the part of this whole story that has always been the hardest to accept. Because in the end, whoever it was who let themselves into Bob Crane's apartment that night and picked up that camera tripod and tied that electrical cord in that neat little bow around his neck is still on paper, out there somewhere. And if it was not John Henry Carpenter, then whoever it actually was got to walk away from the murder of one of the most famous television actors in American history and take that secret with them all the way to the grave. I hope you're enjoying the stories. Do not forget, if you're into stories from the world of movies, crime, and hip-hop history, told in this format, you're in the right place. So, if this sounds like your thing, go ahead and hit subscribe, like, and comment. All right, let's get back into the story. The man who latched the door today's story is about one of the most beloved TV stars in the entire history of American television, who walked into a hotel room in Florida in the early morning hours of a Sunday in January of 2022, latched the door behind him, and never came back out alive. And when his autopsy report came back, weeks later, it showed something so bizarre and so unexplainable that the investigators who had worked the case would go on to call it one of the strangest deaths they had ever seen. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, welcome to Jaja. Please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. At around 3 in the afternoon on Sunday, January 9th, 2022, at a luxury resort called the Ritz-Carlton Orlando Grande Lakes, a hotel security officer named Jody Lee Harrison was walking down the hallway of the 9th floor. He was on his way to a suite because the family of one of the guests had called the hotel a little bit earlier, and they had asked for a well-being check. Because the guest in that suite was a 65-year-old man who had been touring around Florida for the last few days doing stand-up comedy shows. He was supposed to have flown home to his wife in California that morning, but he had never boarded his flight. He was supposed to have checked out of the hotel by noon, but he had never checked out. His wife had been calling him all morning. He was not picking up. And so eventually, she had called the hotel and asked them to just send someone up to knock on the door and make sure everything was okay. When Jody Harrison got to the door of the suite, he knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder, still nothing. So he pulled out his master key card and he swiped it against the electronic lock. The light turned green. He pushed the door. But the door did not open because someone had latched the door from the inside. Jody stood in the hallway for a second, kind of thinking about what to do. Then he pulled out his radio and called down to hotel maintenance and asked them to send somebody up. Because if the door was latched from the inside, that meant the guest was almost certainly still in the room. A few minutes later, a maintenance worker showed up with the tool that basically defeats an interior door latch, and together they got the door open. Jody stepped inside. The first thing Jody noticed was that all of the lights in the suite were off, and the curtains were drawn. It was completely dark. The second thing he noticed was that the guests' bags were sitting neatly by the door, already packed. It was the kind of thing you would see from a guest who had gotten ready to check out, and then for whatever reason had just laid back down. So Jody walked further into the suite, calling out. And when he got to the bedroom, he saw a man on the bed. The man was laying on his back, on top of the covers. His left arm was resting across his chest. His right arm was resting on the bed next to him. His eyes were closed. And for a second, Jody thought he was just asleep. But then Jody walked over to the bed, and he leaned down, and he reached out and touched the man on the shoulder. And the man's skin was cold. Jody checked for breathing. There was none. He checked for a pulse. There was none. Jody immediately got back on his radio, and he told hotel dispatch to call 911. Within a few minutes, deputies from the Orange County Sheriff's Office and paramedics from the fire department were swarming into the suite. Paramedics tried to revive him, but there was nothing they could do. He had been dead for hours. At 4:18 p.m., they officially pronounced him dead in the room. When the deputies started going through the suite to figure out who this man was and what had happened to him, they realized very quickly that the man on the bed was not just some random hotel guest. He was one of the most famous television actors in America, because his name was Bob Saget. Bob Saget had grown up outside of Philadelphia. He had been born in May of 1956 to a father named Benjamin, who worked as a supermarket executive, and a mother named Rosalind, who worked in hospital administration. Bob had gotten into comedy when he was really young, and he had been doing stand-up in comedy clubs since he was in his early 20s. Then in the fall of 1987, when Bob was 31 years old, he had been cast in the lead role of a brand new sitcom on ABC called Full House, where he would play a widowed San Francisco sportscaster named Danny Tanner, who was raising his 3 young daughters with help from his brother-in-law and his best friend. And the show basically defined a whole generation of American TV. Full House ran for 8 seasons, from 1987 all the way to 1995. And during that same period, Bob was also hosting a hit ABC show called America's Funniest Home Videos, which was basically the show that started the entire era of viral video content that we still see all over the internet today. And so throughout the late 80s and the 90s, if you were an American kid, Bob Saget was basically your TV dad. He was the wholesome, sweater-wearing, corny joke-telling face of American family television. But there was another side to Bob Saget that a lot of his young Full House fans had no idea about. Because in his real life, offstage, Bob Saget was actually one of the dirtiest, most brutal stand-up comedians in the entire industry. His live comedy sets were legendarily filthy. They were the exact opposite of the wholesome dad character he played on TV. And a lot of Bob's fellow comedians, people like Chris Rock and Jim Carrey and Norm Macdonald, considered him basically a comedian's comedian. He was somebody the other comics all respected. After Full House ended in 1995, Bob's career went through a bunch of ups and downs. He did stand-up, he directed movies, he had guest roles on other shows. Then in 2016, Netflix launched a reboot of Full House called Fuller House. And Bob came back to play Danny Tanner all over again for a whole new generation of kids. And in 2018, Bob got married to a food and travel blogger named Kelly Rizzo, who was 20 years younger than him. Bob had 3 adult daughters from a previous marriage, and Kelly loved them like her own. And by all accounts, Bob was really, really happy. And by the start of 2022, so a couple of years after Fuller House had wrapped, Bob was actually kind of experiencing a career comeback. He had launched a new stand-up tour that he was calling the I Don't Do Negative Tour, and the tour was selling out. On Friday, January 7th, 2022, Bob performed at a venue in Orlando, Florida called the Hard Rock Live. And when he got back to his hotel that night, he was so happy about how the show had gone that he posted about it on Instagram. He wrote, quote, "This pic was pre-show, but holy sh*t, did I love that amazing audience just now at the Hard Rock Live Orlando. A perfect first show of 2022. That was the fastest hour and 45 minutes I've ever lived through." The next night, on Saturday, January 8th, Bob got in a rental car and he drove up to the Jacksonville area, where he was scheduled to perform at a venue called the Ponte Vedra Concert Hall. And this show went even better than the first one had. Bob ended up doing a 2-hour set. The audience loved him. And after the show, at around 3 in the morning, Bob posted on Twitter, quote, "Love tonight's show at Ponte Vedra Concert Hall. Appreciative audience. I had no idea I did a 2-hour set tonight. I'm happily addicted again to this stuff." Then Bob got back in his rental car, and in the middle of the night, he made the drive from Ponte Vedra back down to Orlando. And at approximately 2:20 in the morning on Sunday, January 9th, according to the electronic records at the Ritz-Carlton, Bob's rental car pulled up under the main entrance of the hotel. He got out. He said hello to the valet, who was working the overnight shift. And the two of them actually took a photo together, which the police would release publicly a few months later. And the valet later told investigators that when Bob got out of the car and started chatting with him, Bob seemed completely fine. He was not slurring his words. He was not stumbling. He was not having any trouble with his balance. He seemed like a completely normal 65-year-old guy who had just wrapped up a stand-up show and was heading up to his room to get some sleep. Bob walked into the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton, took the elevator up to the 9th floor, walked down the hallway, opened the door of his suite with his key card, at approximately 2:20 in the morning, walked inside and latched the door from the inside behind him. Nobody would ever see him alive again. Now, when the Orange County deputies first started investigating the scene inside of Bob Saget's suite that afternoon, the picture they were looking at basically made no sense. Because on paper, everything about the scene said Bob had died a totally peaceful, natural death. His bags were packed by the door, meaning he had gotten up in the morning, gotten dressed, gotten organized, and prepared to check out. His body was found neatly on the bed. There were no signs of any kind of struggle. There were no signs of forced entry. There were no drugs. There was no alcohol. There was no bottle of pills nearby. The room was clean. And even though there was a connecting door between Bob's suite and the suite next door, the electronic lock records showed that nobody had entered the adjacent room since Friday the 7th, 2 days before Bob had died. So they knew nobody had gotten to him from that side either. The only real physical detail on Bob's body itself that seemed unusual was a very small bruise and a small area of slight swelling in the corner of his left eye, but it was minor. It looked like something you might get from bumping into a corner of a piece of furniture. Nothing that would kill a person. So for the first few weeks after Bob's death, the whole world basically assumed that Bob had died of some kind of natural medical event. Maybe a heart attack, maybe an aneurysm. Something that had happened to him in his sleep, silently, with no warning. His wife, Kelly Rizzo, issued a statement calling him her absolute everything and saying she was completely shattered. His daughters mourned him publicly. The entire Full House cast mourned him publicly. And that was that. Except that was not that. Because a few weeks later, the results of Bob Saget's autopsy came back from the Orange County Medical Examiner's Office. And when the investigators read the report, they were basically shocked. Because the report did not describe a peaceful natural death. The report described the injuries of somebody who had been through something horrific. Bob Saget's skull had multiple fractures. The base of his skull was fractured. Both of his eye sockets were fractured. There were bruises on both sides of his brain. And there was bleeding between his brain and the tissue covering his brain, which is a condition called a subdural hematoma. And when the medical examiner sat down and evaluated the pattern of injuries that Bob had, the pattern was consistent with what the report described as a high-force impact. The kind of impact you would normally see in a serious car accident, or a fall from a significant height, or a violent physical assault. But according to everybody investigators talked to, none of those things had happened to Bob Saget. He had not been in a car accident. He had not fallen from any height. There was absolutely no evidence that anybody else had been in his hotel room that night. And yet somehow, at some point between when he had latched the door behind him at 2:20 in the morning and when hotel security had found him in the afternoon, Bob Saget had suffered the kind of head injuries that should not have even been survivable, let alone injuries that a 65-year-old man would apparently just walk off and go to sleep. The investigators eventually put together a theory. Their theory was that at some point after Bob had walked into his suite, he had gone into the bathroom. And somewhere in that bathroom, most likely on the marble floor, he had fallen backward, and he had hit the back of his head with a lot of force. And then, according to the theory, Bob had gotten up, and he had not realized how bad the injury was. He had thought he was fine. Or he had thought he had just given himself a bump on the head. And so he had walked out of the bathroom, laid down on the bed, and gone to sleep. And in his sleep, as the internal bleeding around his brain had gotten worse and worse, he had quietly died. But even the investigators who came up with that theory admitted that a lot of it did not add up. Because with the level of injuries Bob had suffered, most doctors would say a person would have almost immediately known something was catastrophically wrong. There would have been intense pain. There would have been dizziness. There would have been confusion. And yet Bob, according to that theory, had just laid down and gone to sleep, neatly on his back, with his bags packed by the door. And to this day, over 3 years after Bob Saget's death, that is the official version of what happened to him at the Ritz-Carlton Orlando in the early morning hours of January 9th, 2022. Accidental head trauma, no foul play, case closed. But among the deputies and detectives who actually worked that case, and among the medical examiners who looked at the injuries, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. Because whatever happened to Bob Saget in that hotel room, the exact where and the exact how of it has never been fully explained. Nobody has ever identified exactly what he hit his head on. Nobody has ever explained how he could have sustained fractures across the base of his skull and around both of his eye sockets without knowing something was very seriously wrong. And nobody has ever explained why one of the most famous TV dads in the history of American television, who had just walked into his own hotel room after a successful stand-up show, latched the door behind him and greeted the valet on his way in with a smile, was found by a security officer a few hours later, cold and unresponsive on a bed with his bags already packed by the door. For his family, who continue to keep his memory alive, they have made peace with the fact that they may never fully know. But for the officers who were the first ones into that suite on the 9th floor of the Ritz-Carlton on the afternoon of January 9th, 2022, and who had to stand in that room and try to understand what they were looking at, the death of Bob Saget is one of the strangest cases they have ever seen. and it is a case that in a lot of ways is still open. The man who bought the base on a Friday night in 1992 in the city of Atlanta, Georgia, a 22-year-old man was standing backstage at a small theater on 14th Street called the 14th Street Playhouse. And he was about to walk out onto the stage in front of an audience for the biggest night of his entire life. Because this guy had been working towards this moment for over a year. He had moved to Atlanta a while back with basically no money and no connections. And he had gotten a series of odd jobs working as a bill collector and a used car salesman. And he had lived really cheaply and saved every dollar he could. And when his tax refund came in, he had thrown that in too. And after a lot of saving, this guy had put together $12,000 in cash. And then he had used every single dollar of that $12,000 to rent this theater on 14th Street for the entire weekend. Because he had written a play. And this weekend, he was going to put the play on and make his life change forever. And this guy had done the math in his head over and over again. The theater had 200 seats. He was going to do 6 performances across the weekend, which meant that if the theater sold out every single show, 200 people would come see his play. And based on what tickets cost, he would basically make all of his $12,000 back and then some. And he would be able to just keep doing more shows. And he had been so certain that this was going to work that when his boss at his day job had refused to give him time off for the weekend to put on the play, he had actually just quit his job because he was so sure the play was going to sell out. And so on this Friday night, he was standing backstage and he was ready. But when he peeked out from behind the curtain to look at the audience, his heart just kind of sank because the theater was almost completely empty. And when he did the count, there were only about a dozen people in the audience. And over the course of the whole weekend, when you added up all 6 of the performances, only 30 total people ever came to see the play. And by Sunday night, this guy had lost every single dollar of the $12,000 he had saved. He could not afford his rent, and he could not afford his car payment. And he had already quit his job. And so within a few weeks, this 22-year-old guy had gone from feeling like he was about to change his life to being completely, totally broke and homeless on the streets of Atlanta. But to really understand how this guy had ended up in an empty theater in Atlanta at 22 years old, betting his entire life savings on a play that nobody wanted to see, you have to go all the way back to 1969. In September of 1969, in New Orleans, Louisiana, a woman named Willie Maxine, who was a really devout Christian woman who took her kids to church every single Sunday, gave birth to a baby boy, and she and her husband, a guy named Emmett Perry, named the baby Emmett Perry Jr. But Emmett Jr., from the time he was little, had a really difficult relationship with his father because his father, Emmett Sr., was, according to what Emmett Jr. would later say in interviews, physically abusive. And Emmett Jr.'s childhood was really rough. He was constantly getting beaten. And then outside of the home, other bad stuff happened to him too. And by the time Emmett Jr. was a teenager, he was so miserable that at one point he actually attempted to take his own life. And when Emmett Jr. was 16 years old, he made a decision. He decided he did not want to share a name with his father anymore. And so he went to the courthouse in New Orleans and he legally changed his first name. He picked the name Tyler. And so from that point on, this kid who had been born Emmett Perry Jr. was now Tyler Perry. And then not too long after that, Tyler got kicked out of high school after basically snapping and having this big outburst in the middle of class. And now Tyler was 17, 18 years old, and he was just kind of drifting. He was working odd jobs. He was still living in New Orleans. He was trying to figure out what he was going to do with his life. And then one day, when Tyler was around 20 years old, he was sitting at home and he was watching Oprah on TV, and Oprah was doing an episode about writing. And on that episode, Oprah said that writing about your feelings and your trauma in a journal or in letters to yourself was one of the most powerful ways to process everything you had been through and to basically start to heal. And Tyler had never heard anybody say this before. And so he decided he was going to try it. And so he started writing letters to himself about his childhood and about his father and about everything that had happened to him. And after doing this for a few months, Tyler realized that all of these letters he had been writing were actually starting to look like the outline of a story, like a stage play. And so Tyler decided, you know what, I'm going to turn this into an actual play. and he called the play I Know I've Been Changed. And after Tyler had finished writing the play, he was visiting Atlanta for a big Black college spring break event, and he noticed there was a small theater on 14th Street, and he thought to himself, if I moved to Atlanta and I saved up enough money, I could rent this theater and I could put my play on. And so Tyler moved from New Orleans to Atlanta. He got the jobs. He saved the $12,000. And he rented the 14th Street Playhouse. And that brings us back to that Friday night in 1992, and the empty theater, and the 30 people who ever showed up. But Tyler, even after losing everything and becoming homeless, decided he was not going to give up on the play. And so what he did was he would go get another job, and he would save up money. And then somebody would offer him some money to invest in another run of the play. And then Tyler would quit his job to put the play on. And then the play would fail again, and he would lose all of his money again. And he would end up homeless again, sometimes sleeping in his car, sometimes staying with friends. And then he would go get another job and save up money and try again. And the play would fail again. And this cycle just kept happening. In 1992, in 1993, in 1995, in 1996, and in 1997. For 6 straight years, Tyler basically kept trying to put on his play, and it kept failing, and he kept losing everything. He tried the play in different cities across the South, in places like Spartanburg, South Carolina, and other small towns in Georgia. And each time it would fail, and each time he would end up back where he started, broke and sleeping in his car. And Tyler later said in interviews that during this period of his life, one of the hardest parts of being homeless was actually just how expensive being homeless was, because he did not have a bank account. So every time he got paid at one of his odd jobs, he had to go to a check cashing store, and they would take a big cut of his check just to give him his own money. And he was constantly bleeding money on stuff like that. And by the end of 1997, he was almost 30 years old, and he had literally nothing to show for the last decade of his life except this one play that nobody wanted to see. But in the summer of 1998, so basically the 7th year of Tyler trying to make this thing work, he got one more chance. Somebody offered to help him put on the play at a venue in Atlanta called the House of Blues. And Tyler, who was on the verge of giving up completely, decided he would try one more time. And on that weekend at the House of Blues in Atlanta, something incredible happened. The play sold out. And not only did it sell out, but the audience actually loved it. And they started telling their friends about it. And when Tyler moved the play from the House of Blues to a bigger venue in Atlanta called the Fox Theater, that venue sold out too. And then it sold out again, and again, 8 times in a row. And after 6 years of failure, Tyler Perry had finally cracked it. And once Tyler figured out the formula, he just started cranking out play after play after play. In 1999, in one of his new plays called I Can Do Bad All By Myself, he introduced a character that he played himself in a gray wig and a floral dress and a set of pearls. She was this 6'5", big, tough, no-nonsense Southern grandmother, and he called her Medea. And American audiences, especially Black American audiences, who recognized in Medea every strong grandmother and auntie they had ever known, absolutely lost their minds over her. Tyler would basically fill every seat of every theater in every city he took Medea to. And by the early 2000s, Tyler was making tens of millions of dollars a year just on stage plays and DVD sales of those plays. And in 2005, Tyler decided to take Medea to the movies. He wrote and starred in a film called Diary of a Mad Black Woman. And the film opened at #1 at the box office, and it made over $50 million. And Tyler suddenly went from being a stage play guy that Hollywood barely knew about to being one of the biggest and most successful producers in Hollywood. But this is not even the biggest part of the story. Because in June of 2015, Tyler Perry, this guy who 23 years earlier had been sleeping in his car in Atlanta because his play had failed, went and did something almost nobody in the history of Hollywood had ever done. He walked into a real estate deal, and he spent $30 million, and he bought 330 acres of land in southwest Atlanta. And the land that Tyler bought was not just any land. It was a decommissioned United States Army base called Fort McPherson. And when Tyler turned that land into his personal movie studio, it became one of the largest movie studios in the entire United States. It was bigger than most of the studios in Hollywood. And Tyler Perry, this kid who had been born Emmett Perry Jr., and had been physically abused by his father and had once tried to take his own life, became the first black person in the history of the United States to solely own a major film studio. But there is one final part to the story of that land, because in 2019, Tyler was accepting the Icon Award at the BET Awards, and while he was on stage, he told the audience the history of the land that he had bought in 2015, because that land, Fort McPherson, before it had ever been a United States Army base, had been used by the Confederate Army during the Civil War, back in the 1860s. And Tyler stood up on that stage at the BET Awards, and he said, quote, "The studio was once a Confederate Army base, which meant that there were Confederate soldiers on that base plotting and planning on how to keep 3.9 million Negroes enslaved." And then he said, "And now that land is owned by one Negro." And that is the true story of how a homeless 22-year-old who lost his entire life savings on a play that only 30 people came to see ended up owning the same 330 acres of Georgia land where, 150 years before he was born, Confederate soldiers had once sat plotting to keep his ancestors enslaved.